Welcome back, everyone, to another deep dive. This time, we're taking a trip back in time to the late 15th and early 16th centuries. It was a period of incredible change and upheaval, with the invention of the printing press poised to revolutionize the spread of knowledge. But what became one of the hottest items flying off those new presses? Witch hunting manuals.
It really is a fascinating and somewhat disturbing paradox, isn't it? This technology, with so much potential to spread enlightenment, ends up being used to fuel a period of intense fear and persecution.
Yeah, it's kind of like the printing press gave a megaphone to some pretty dark and dangerous ideas.
That's a great way to put it.
And speaking of dark ideas, we can't talk about this era without mentioning, of course, the Malleus Maleficarum, also known as the Hammer of Witches. Book was, well, basically the witch hunter's Bible, right?
Absolutely. The Malleus Maleficarum became an absolute publishing sensation, spreading rapidly across Europe, thanks in no small part to the printing press. And really, it's this book that codified many of the beliefs about witchcraft, demonized women, and laid the groundwork for countless trials and executions.
It's really chilling to think about, how much influence a single book could have, especially in that era. And you know what makes it even more unsettling is that the author, Heinrich Kramer, had a pretty shady past himself.
That's right. Before he became this, infamous witch hunting inquisitor, Kramer was actually accused of sexual misconduct and forced to flee his own town. So it really makes you wonder how much of his obsession with witchcraft, particularly his focus on female sexuality and weakness, stemmed from his own, shall we say, personal demons.
Wow, talk about irony, right? This guy who's basically run out of town for his own questionable behavior goes on to write the book that basically defines evil for an entire generation and fuels the persecution of thousands.
It really highlights the hypocrisy that was often at play during this period. But putting aside Kramer's personal life for a moment, it's important to understand the broader context of witchcraft beliefs before the printing press came along. The printing press really did change things dramatically.
Yeah, I imagine the concept of a witch, as we think of it, didn't just appear overnight.
Right.
So what was the general perception of witchcraft like before the 15th century, before all of this was being printed and spread around?
Well, the belief in magic and people who practiced it, it existed, but it wasn't as organized or as demonized as it would later become. So, for instance, in the early Middle Ages, the church had a document called the Canon Episcopi, which basically dismissed all those stories of women flying through the night and consorting with demons. They said it was all just, delusions.
So even the church wasn't totally on board with the idea of witches as, like the stereotypical image we have in our minds.
Not really. The Canon Episcopi shows a much more nuanced view of magic. They acknowledge that harmful magic might exist, but they attributed it to human trickery or just, people being deceptive rather than these big demonic pacts.
So was there any sense of evil, like true evil associated with magic in these earlier beliefs?
Well, there were definitely figures in folklore and mythology that were associated with harmful magic, like creatures called Strigae and Lamia that were described by chroniclers like Gervase of Tilbury. And these were often depicted as, these really demonic beings that would prey on children and drink blood, that kind of thing. But even these figures, they weren't universally seen as witches in the sense that the Malleus would later define them.
So it sounds like the idea of witchcraft was already evolving over time, but it was really the Malleus, amplified by the printing press, that cemented a very specific image of the witch in the public imagination.
Right. Exactly. The Malleus took all those kind of scattered threads of folklore and superstition and, these anxieties about women that were already present in society and wove them into this terrifying narrative that really resonated with a society that was grappling with a lot of rapid changes and a lot of uncertainty.
It's kind of like how today we see sensationalized stories and misinformation spreading so quickly on social media and online. Some things never change, huh?
Unfortunately, you're right. The tendency to fear what we don't understand and to look for scapegoats for our problems and, be really swayed by these captivating narratives, even if they're not based on facts, it's something that seems to transcend time and technology.
It's both fascinating and disturbing to see how those patterns repeat themselves throughout history. But before we get too lost in, all the parallels with our own time, I want to dig a little deeper into the Malleus and the specific claims that it made about witchcraft. Because it wasn't just about, like casting spells and causing a little mischief, was it?
No, not at all. The Malleus painted a very specific and very detailed picture of how witchcraft worked, who was most susceptible to it, and the horrifying consequences of, supposedly dabbling in the dark arts. And one of its most insidious and frankly disturbing legacies was the way it demonized women and their sexuality.
We've kind of touched on this a bit already, but can you elaborate a little more on how the Malleus specifically targeted women? Because, it's not like men were completely excluded from accusations, right?
That's right. Men could be accused of witchcraft, but the Malleus really placed women at the very center of this, this whole supposed demonic conspiracy.
And why was that? Why women?
Well, the Malleus drew on existing misogynistic beliefs that were very common at the time. This idea that women were inherently weaker than men, both physically and mentally, and that they were more easily tempted by the devil, more susceptible to his influence, more likely to succumb to their carnal desires, all of that.
So basically, women were seen as, like, the gateway for evil to enter the world.
That's one way to put it. The Malleus portrayed women as being inherently dangerous, their very existence posing a threat to the social order. And it's no coincidence that many of the accusations were leveled against women who were already marginalized in society or seen as a burden. Widows, elderly women, women who couldn't bear children, all of them were very easy targets.
It's heartbreaking to think about how those prejudices, and really just pre-existing prejudices, were amplified by this book, The Malleus,
Yeah.
and could have such devastating consequences for so many innocent people.
Absolutely. And it's a stark reminder of how dangerous it is to let fear and ignorance dictate our actions, and how easily those in power can exploit those tendencies for their own ends. Welcome back to our deep dive into, well, witches and printing presses. Before the break, we were talking about how the Malleus Maleficarum, it really exploited all those pre-existing fears and that folklore that was already out there to create this really terrifying image of, of what a witch was.
Yeah, and it's amazing how just this one book, amplified by, the printing press, this brand new technology, managed to really shape an entire era's perception of witchcraft. But let's get down to like the nitty-gritty here. What were some of the specific accusations that people would make against those who were accused of being witches?
Well, the accusations, they were really as varied as the communities they sprang from. But there were some common themes that emerged, when you start to examine the historical records. Things like causing illness or misfortune, controlling the weather, harming livestock. These were kind of, staples. These were the things that really, were at the core of a lot of the witch accusations.
So like if your cow suddenly stopped giving milk, your neighbor might think you were a witch.
Exactly. The Malleus really blurred the lines between, those everyday misfortunes that happen to everyone and the supernatural. And so it created this environment that was just ripe for suspicion and paranoia. It even went so far as to say that witches could steal men's penises.
Wait, hold on.
Yeah. And that they would keep them, as the book so delicately puts it, in nests in trees.
Penis nests in trees. That sounds ridiculous.
It does sound absurd to us now, right? But this belief, as outlandish as it might seem, it actually reveals a lot about the anxieties, of that time period. It really highlights the deep fear of female power, particularly over male sexuality.
Yeah, you know what, when you put it that way, it's not so funny anymore. It's actually pretty disturbing. It shows just how deep-seated those fears were and how easily they could be manipulated to target women.
Exactly. And the printing press, again, played such a critical role in disseminating these ideas and legitimizing them in the eyes of the public. Imagine you're living in, just a small village back in the 16th century. Suddenly, all these pamphlets and woodcuts start appearing, and they're depicting, witches stealing penises and hiding them in trees. It's not hard to see how that kind of imagery, how quickly that could fuel mass hysteria and suspicion.
It's like the printing press was, I don't know, like an early prototype for social media today, where misinformation and all these sensationalized stories can just spread so rapidly and have real-world consequences.
That's a great analogy. Yeah. Both, the printing press back then and social media today, they're really powerful tools for communication, but they can also be used to spread fear and prejudice and ultimately violence.
So, it's a pretty bleak picture that we're painting of this whole era. Were there any voices of reason during this time? Was anyone pushing back against these, frankly, pretty outlandish accusations?
Oh, absolutely. There were always skeptics. There were dissenters, even during, kind of what we think of as the height of the witch hunts. Some people questioned the evidence that was being used in these trials, pointing out that, many of the confessions that they were getting were coerced, through torture. And others argued that blaming witchcraft for misfortunes, it was just a way to kind of avoid addressing the real social and economic problems that they were facing at the time.
So even in the midst of all this fear and hysteria, there were those who still dared to challenge, kind of the prevailing narrative.
Yes, there were. And I think it reminds us that, even in those darkest of times, there are always those who stand up for reason, for justice, for compassion. Unfortunately, those voices were often, drowned out by the chorus of,
Sure.
the chorus of fear and persecution.
Yeah, it makes you wonder how things might have unfolded differently if those voices of reason, if they had had a platform as powerful as the printing press to get their message out there, to really spread their ideas.
I know, it's a fascinating thought experiment. Imagine if alongside the Malleus Maleficarum, there were pamphlets circulating that were, debunking all the myths about witchcraft and promoting critical thinking, advocating for fair treatment of those accused, all that. Maybe the witch hunts, maybe they wouldn't have been as widespread or as brutal.
Right. It's a reminder that, we all have a responsibility, right, to use our own voices to challenge injustice and to promote, just basic human understanding, especially in a world like today where misinformation can spread so easily, and divisive rhetoric is everywhere.
I agree. We absolutely do. We have to be very vigilant in, our own pursuit of truth and justice, using the tools that we have to amplify those voices of reason and compassion. We can't let fear and ignorance win.
That's a really good point. Now, I'm curious, to learn more about like the trials themselves. What was it actually like to, to go through that process if you were accused of witchcraft?
Well, the process itself, it varied a lot. It depended on the location, the severity of the accusations, but generally it would begin with an accusation, and that could stem from, all sorts of things, maybe a personal grudge, or a desire for revenge. Sometimes people would just need to explain a misfortune that happened in their lives.
So basically, it sounds like anyone could accuse anyone else of witchcraft, and then, the person accused would be forced to defend themselves.
It wasn't quite that, quite that simple, but the bar for what they considered evidence was remarkably low. I mean, hearsay, rumors, just personal testimonies, they were often considered enough to warrant a full investigation.
That's terrifying. It sounds like a system that was, basically designed to create scapegoats rather than to actually, find truth and deliver justice.
Yeah, I mean, that's a fair assessment. Once you were accused, that was it. I mean,
Yeah.
you'd be subjected to interrogation, often under duress. And, the Malleus, helpfully offered very detailed instructions on how to extract confessions, including the use of torture.
Oh, wow. So basically it was, guilty until proven innocent.
I mean, it was more like guilty until you confessed, even if that confession was, basically coerced through just unimaginable pain and suffering.
It's hard to, it's really hard to fathom the level of cruelty that was inflicted on these individuals, many of whom, as we've been saying, were totally innocent.
It's a very dark chapter in human history,
Yeah.
and I think it's important to remember that, we're not just talking about some abstract events here, These were real people whose lives were completely destroyed, just utterly destroyed by fear, ignorance, just the abuse of power.
Speaking of that abuse of power, I'm curious, who are the main players in all of this?
Yeah.
Was it, primarily a religious affair, like driven by the church?
Well, the church definitely played a huge role in, shaping the whole narrative around witchcraft. But the actual trials, the trials themselves, were often carried out by, secular authorities.
So it wasn't just like, priests and inquisitors running around, hunting down witches.
Not at all. Judges, magistrates, even just local officials, they were all involved in investigating and prosecuting anyone accused of witchcraft.
I guess that makes sense. After all, I mean, witchcraft was seen as a threat to the social order, right? So,
Yeah.
The secular authorities, they'd want to, maintain stability and control.
Exactly. And the Malleus, with all those detailed instructions, it provided a very convenient framework for those in power to exert their authority and, really solidify control over their communities.
So a classic example of how fear can be used as a tool for, for social control. When people are afraid, they're much more likely to accept those kind of authoritarian measures and not really question those in power.
Right. You've hit on a crucial point. The witch hunts, they weren't just about persecuting individuals. They were about maintaining a very specific social and religious order. They were a way to silence anyone who disagreed, to reinforce traditional values, to really suppress any challenges to that established hierarchy.
It's just a reminder, a sobering reminder that fight for justice and freedom, it's never truly over. We always have to be wary of those who might try to, exploit fear and division for their own personal gain.
I agree. You're absolutely right. We can't just let the lessons of the past, fade away and be forgotten. We have to learn from these historical injustices, and we have to strive to create a more just and equitable world, for everyone.
That's a powerful message. We've explored the accusations, the trials, the role of, both the religious and the secular authorities, all of that. But there's still so much more, to uncover here, isn't there?
Oh, definitely. In our next segment, we're going to delve into, more of the psychology and the sociology, the factors that really contributed to this era of fear and persecution. We'll examine how human nature, social anxieties, the power of storytelling, all of those things, all converge to create this perfect storm, for the witch hunts to thrive.
Wow, that's going to be fascinating. I mean, to explore that darker side of human history and, what we can learn from it, right? To hopefully create a more enlightened future.
Exactly.
So stay tuned, everyone, for the final part of our deep dive.
Welcome back, everyone, to the final part of our deep dive on witches and printing presses.
Yeah, it's been quite the journey, hasn't it? From exploring, I guess, the evolution of, like, how witchcraft was even thought about and talked about. And then, the chilling impact of the Malleus Maleficarum and the printing press.
Yeah, some of it's been, really disturbing. But I think it's important to remember that, we're not just like revisiting the past because it's, I don't know, like morbidly interesting,
Right. We're trying to understand how, how an entire society could kind of succumb to that level of, fear and persecution. And maybe more importantly, like what lessons can we actually learn from this whole dark chapter, right? To, hopefully prevent anything similar from ever happening again.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, with that in mind, I guess let's talk about, what eventually caused the decline of the witch hunts. They didn't just disappear overnight, right?
No, definitely not. The witch trials, they went on for centuries in, different places with, varying intensity. But there were a few, there were several factors that kind of, came together and ultimately contributed to their decline.
What were some of the, I guess, like the turning points?
Well, the Enlightenment was huge. That whole intellectual and cultural movement, that really emphasized reason and scientific inquiry and individual liberty, it really challenged all those superstitious beliefs that had fueled, the witch hunts for so long.
So I guess, as science started to offer more rational explanations for things like, natural phenomena, the appeal of blaming witches for, I don't know, a bad harvest or, like sudden illness, that started to fade away.
Exactly. People began to question, was the evidence they were using any good? Were the confessions that they were getting actually real? And then the whole idea that witches could actually, control the forces of nature.
It's just amazing how a shift in thinking, like just a move towards logic and reason, can have such a huge impact on society.
It really is. It shows just how powerful, ideas can be. The Enlightenment, it wasn't just about, scientific discoveries. It was about, really challenging traditional authority, questioning dogma, advocating for human rights.
And those ideas, much like the ideas that were spread by the printing press, during those witch hunts, they had a ripple effect and led to, some really significant changes, both socially and politically.
For sure. The Enlightenment laid the groundwork for movements like, the abolition of slavery and the fight for women's right to vote and the whole idea of recognizing universal human rights. It's a legacy that continues to inspire people all over the world, even today.
But even though, those witch hunts, they did eventually, kind of subside and eventually kind of fade away.
Yeah.
But their legacy, it's still with us today, isn't it?
Unfortunately, yeah, it is. I mean, you still see, these remnants of, kind of those old fears and prejudices in the way that, certain groups are still, scapegoated and, demonized, and just the persistence of conspiracy theories and how easy it still is for misinformation to spread,
Yeah.
and incite violence.
It's a sobering reminder that that fight, the fight against ignorance and fear and intolerance, it's never really over, is it? We have to stay, we have to stay vigilant and use our voices to, to challenge injustice wherever we see it.
I agree. 100%. And I think, even the printing press, for all, its complexities, I think it offers a valuable lesson here.
Oh, so.
Well, the printing press, as we've been saying, it was a double-edged sword. It had the power to spread knowledge, for sure,
Mhm.
but also misinformation to, to enlighten people, but also to incite them. It was used to amplify voices of reason, but also voices of, fanaticism.
So I guess the lesson is that, technology itself isn't necessarily good or bad. It's how we use it, right? That's what really determines the impact it'll have on society.
Exactly. We have a responsibility to use all these tools that are available to us, whether it's, the printing press back then or, the internet or social media that we have today, to promote understanding and critical thinking and compassion.
Yeah. It's like a call to action for all of us, I think, to be more discerning about the information that we're consuming and to challenge those harmful narratives that are out there.
Yeah.
And really just, use our voices to advocate for a more just and equitable world.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And I think that's a fitting note to, to kind of wrap up our deep dive.
Yeah, it really is. We've covered so much today, exploring the history and the social and psychological factors, everything that kind of contributed to, the rise and fall of the witch hunts. It's been a journey, you know,
Mm.
through some dark, really unsettling parts of human history, but I hope it's also been a journey of discovery and reflection for everyone listening.
It has been for me, for sure. And I think, by trying to understand the past, we can better prepare ourselves to face the challenges of the present and, hopefully build a better future, a future where, knowledge and reason and compassion, really prevail.
Well said. And thank you, everyone for joining us on this deep dive. I hope, you learned something new and gained a better understanding of, this incredibly complex period in history, and maybe, just maybe, been inspired to reflect a little bit on, the power of ideas and, how important it is to use your own voice to make the world, a better place. So until next time, everyone, keep exploring, keep questioning, keep that spirit of curiosity alive.